Hey everyone, this is Tom, and this week's character is Fargrim Rockbeard for Chris. We finally got a dwarf. Now I did set out and I did the first themed week where it was just open to dwarven characters, and usually there's quite a big response of people entering. But when I made it for dwarves only, it felt like probably like 10 or 20 is probably more, but very few people actually participated. Dwarves are my favorite. They're my favorite fantasy race or creature. They're what I always like to play as, and I've just been dying and hoping to get to finally draw one. But I sort of thought more people would play as them, but so far I've been getting a lot of half elves and human characters. But I do remember finding out, working at BioWare, that on Dragon Age they found out that only 4% of people play as dwarves, and I kind of, once I remembered that, I sort of feared that that's probably just the case pretty much everywhere as far as like fantasy gaming goes, whether it's video game role playing. So I figured if I'm really going to draw a dwarf or get around to it, I'm going to have to hedge my bets a little bit. So it was great. It was fun. I finally got to draw a dwarf. I'm probably going to have more dwarf weeks in the future. Well, I'm going to. But I'd also like to open it up to other sort of races or classes or combinations or anything. And just to kind of help get people, I don't know, just some more variety. And also people with more uncommon classes to get their stuff drawn. It's also just more interesting and fun. I mean, there's a major challenge in, like, if you're doing a bunch of half elves, like how do you make like 30 half elves all distinct, and that's part of the challenge. But I'd like the variety. But either way, let's get back to the dwarf stuff. So with dwarves, there's a lot of ways you can go. I've never been a fan of like the like World of Warcraft style dwarf, where they've just got these arms that go down to their feet, and they're like shaped like a hockey net as far as their silhouette goes, and it's just a bit too much. I'm more of pretty much with all, or like most fantasy things, I'm very Tolkienian in how I kind of think of things. So like the dwarves in Tolkien were largely more or less kind of human shaped, definitely stockier and stronger, but they weren't quite so monstrous as a lot of fantasy artists tend to go. There actually are, like, you can definitely push it. There's no limit. There's no best way to do it. There's a lot of there's so much variety and possibility for how to set up the proportions for dwarves and stuff. Like Justin Gerard, he's got great dwarves, but they're very very exaggerated proportions, and but his style sort of matches it too. Like I definitely draw a bit more realistic, or not. I guess I don't know, just sort of less. Not more realistic, but just sort of less stylized. I'd like to go more stylized, but either way. So sticking with just something that fits in more with the tone of just how I typically draw. So the skeleton is going to be something that's going to have to be adjusted, especially for dwarves. Things like, even though the limbs and things are stockier by proportion, they're also quite a bit more robust. Dwarves are renowned for having, higher constitutions, and they're just sort of more durable and hardy and more physically kind of strong and resilient. And so I thought by having that sort of start off with the skeleton might help with sort of keeping that all the structure sort of properly hefty. So like, even though the femurs are short, they're very thick, and like the knee joints and everything is more straight. As far as like the skull, like I usually give dwarves shorter craniums, or not like sticking out the back, but in height, like less vertically high. I like having the faces closer to the top of the head. It just kind of helps make the faces look bigger and less childlike. When you have a character that's entering the sort of proportional realm of a child, it's good to kind of counteract any chance of somebody interpreting it that way by making the cranium smaller. because when the cranium gets big, it starts looking like a toddler, and it definitely looks a lot more like a toddler when the body's all stocky and all that stuff. So that's kind of a way to help fight that. At least that's how I do it. So there's so many different ways to go about drawing any sort of fantasy creature or race or whatever you've got going. When it comes to doing humanoid figures, it really helps to study, at least I find, it really helps to do a bunch of studies of hominids, things like Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis and all the different, like all those guys. It's really good to sort of see how like a humanoid body can be flared out from a biological standpoint, or like how much exploration there can be in that sort of regard. It doesn't mean that you're like now you are only restricted to these sorts of frames or these sorts of proportions or skeletons, and you're only allowed to pick them from this pile or this batch. But it's not at all like that. It's not like a fruit salad where you're taking clips from stuff that exists and mixing it together. It's really just better to see, I don't know, just by seeing the variety and how the structure affects the body, it gives you a more of an intuitive feeling of like, I guess like biomechanics, or like just like the influence of structure on lifestyle, or even the other way around, like the way that something's lifestyle affects the way that it's formed, and just having that in your mind helps a lot. So with that in mind, when I do dwarven skeletons and stuff, I often do think about Neanderthals. They didn't have a skeleton quite as robust as this dwarf here, but it's definitely in that sort of direction. Even the shape of the cranium, Neanderthals didn't have, like, they had a similar thing where the cranium wasn't as high, but it did stick out quite far out the back, and it had like this little, what's called the bun. It's just sort of extra nubbin of bone on the back, heavy brow and all that stuff. I don't think they had any like sagittal ridges or anything, but or sagittal keel, it would be called on a smaller, whatever. But even like kind of the robustness of the torso, like the rib cage and pelvis and all that stuff, and it just kind of helps to have that sort of grounding, especially like if you're going to be doing orcs. Looking at, I've mentioned it before, but gorilla skeletons, but also hominid skeletons is an excellent reference for that sort of stuff. Just seeing how, like, if you are going to like add longer limbs, just seeing kind of what the bone would need to be like in order to do that, or like what you can sort of get away with, how far you can push something, and just sort of getting a sense of, if it looks like this on the inside, it's probably I know it's gonna look like that on the outside, and then sort of learning how to wield that just through time and experience and practice and exploration. So it's a lot of rambling. I'll get into a bit of the character here. So Fargrim Rockbeard, a dwarf, finally. He's a male, he's a paladin, also of Tyr. The last character was a monk of Tyr. That was Illyria Nilo. Sort of neat having 2 Tyr followers in a row. He's got an Oath of Vengeance. He's a mountain dwarf with a sailor background. I did find it a bit difficult to find any way to kind of hint back to the sailor background, especially just with how covered up he was with the list of outfit, or the parts of outfit stuff that Chris described. But anyway, he is lawful good, although the character did he's got quite an arc. He's starting off with as like a true neutral character, and then he's kind of like a character who's going to be improved on and grow and learn lessons and just become a better man as he goes. Let's see what else. He's 47. He's 4'8", which is kind of tall for a dwarf. He's 175 pounds. He's got light brown skin, dark brown hair, hazel eyes. He's a yarn spinner. He'll exaggerate stories for the sake of for the entertainment value. He's just like extroverted and kind, and enjoys making new friends and sailing around to new ports and drinking, as all dwarves are. He's more committed to crewmates than to ideals. Let's see what else here. So basically, his main motivation is his crew from his ship and his captain were murdered by kind of like ruthless sorcerer pirate types, and now vengeance is going to be his. Pretty straightforward, pretty cool. I like it. It's good for a dwarf. He does have a character flaw, though, that his pride will probably lead to his destruction. It's good old hubris. Chris's sort of intention is to take the character from average Joe to the classic virtuous paladin. He's not there yet. He's still on his way. And even just, so he does line up lawful good, barring a few minor lapses. I'm sure we've all been there. And yeah, that's gonna, Chris has notes about how it's gonna affect his levels, and Chris is definitely thinking far ahead. So, we can go into his outfit in a bit, but Chris, he did describe what he had. He even included pictures of items that he's got that this character is wearing from the player's handbook and sources like that. He's got dwarven plate mail that his father made. He is very proud of it and keeps it well polished. On the chest is the only symbol of Tyr, which is like the hammer with the scales above it. He did include Chris did include an image, just like a little thumbnail of the breastplate of some canon work, but it didn't have to look like it. But I did base it slightly on it with like sort of the all the different lames, like the strips of metal that are all kind of stacked and layered. He's got a blue cloak of protection with a portion around the collar, just as I've drawn it here, but I kind of reduced the impact of the hood, which goes into some of his character stuff that we'll get into. But the Dungeon Master Guide had an image that pretty much nailed it spot on, so I did keep it pretty much canon there. And I usually like to have a bit more leeway on things like that, but I'm also happy to make sure that I just draw the character as is. Like if there's something that's canon or that you've got built in that's from a book, or something that just has to be a particular way, then I'm happy to do it. But sometimes it makes it easier, sometimes it makes things a little bit more difficult. Get into his weapons in a bit, but some more stuff about his background here. So he's a mountain dwarf. He's the son of Adric Rockbeard. That part doesn't have much weight. His clan, the Rockbeards, wasn't very well known. Least of all his father, who was a skilled blacksmith. He's a retired paladin, his father. He didn't really get much credit for being that. And he definitely still even less for work as a blacksmith. Fargrim didn't really understand why his father didn't get that much praise for what he did. He learned from his father as sort of like an apprentice, and learn how to produce quality weapons, but also combat and fighting and more martial skills. The good thing about that Adric ever taught him was that the less your enemy knows about you, the better. He says, you would be wise to live a simple and quiet life, for when you face a truly strong opponent, you will be glad he is not prepared. It's pretty good advice. But despite the knowledge of the fact that his father is quite wise, Fargrim did not heed this advice. He grew restless, hearing stories of other dwarves that accomplished something great, and getting jealous and prideful, more of that hubris. He wanted to be the dwarf in these stories. It's more of this pride nonsense. He had no idea where to start, and so he went to the sea. Naval or like seafaring dwarves seems almost like a huge stretch. I'd love to come across another seafaring dwarf to go with. He's got this plate mail, this this plate mail armor from his father. So I did feel obligated to kind of emphasize it. So he's keeping it well polished. So he's probably kept it maintained overall. In other ways, and one of those would be that it's still complete. It's in good condition and more than just the surface treatment. So if anything I would do would be things like maybe like if his gauntlets, if he didn't have any like bracers or gauntlets, and you could see like a bunch of tattoos, like sailor tattoos up his arms and things like that. But I think the naval stuff seems more like a motivation for the character rather than something that would be visibly apparent on him. But if I did get to draw him again, I would definitely try that out. Maybe something where, like, if he was back at port and just hanging out in the tavern on the dock, then I'd love to sort of draw him more in his sort of casual clothes. That's another thing that a lot of that I kind of like to see is just like characters and outfits that look like it's something that they actually put on that morning or that they would wear every day. Suits of armor, especially things like plate mail, or stuff that one would both need help putting on, but it's incredibly impractical to wear it every day, all day long. So I always like outfits that look like something. It's just a bit more practical in that regard. Now, if they were a king or a knight or someone with a base camp and they work nearby or live nearby, then it was something where it's like, it's time for battle, let's get ready. Then I'm all for characters having suits of armor and drawing them in their armor, but I'm much happier when it's sort of more justified, like the existence of it is more justified. Anyway, so back to his story. So he took to the sea. He felt that if he was ever going to find adventure, it wouldn't be with the mountains. It would be like outside, out in the world. You know, with all the dwarves. If he was ever going to be like a dwarf of yore, it wouldn't be where the dwarfs are all from. It's sort of like a little fish in a big pond kind of thing. Or a big fish in a little pond, or he was a little fish in a little pond, but he wanted to be a big fish in the. You know what I mean. Moving on. So got on a ship, sailed for about a year. He bonded with his crew like they were brothers and sisters. But what would end up being their last voyage, there was a ship above them, some sort of flying vessel. Some sort of enormous ship above them. Covered in pirates, these like dark kind of sorcerer pirates. They killed his crew, they slaughtered him, and Fargrim managed to survive and get away. He felt really bad about it. He fought back, but he was outnumbered, and he took one of their boarding axes and got out of there on an escape boat and paddled his way to Neverwinter. And his crew was gone, so he's a lone survivor. He's got the boarding axe, which is what he's got in his right hand. And that's kind of what he's gonna. I actually really like that part about him, where he's got this one weapon. It's sort of like he's gonna like use it as part of his vengeance, and it's gonna be like what he's gonna like hit them back with. So I think it's kind of cool, like one of those like, you remember me kind of things. So his personality wise, at the beginning of his character arc, he's really self-centered. His only sort of motivation is glory and revenge, and well, it starts as glory and it moves on to revenge. as he sort of goes on through his life, that starts changing. He begins to bond with his new party, and sees it as a chance for redemption and to sort of like live up to and repent for his cowardice to his former crew. Um, so he often tries to act as their protector, um, like getting all of his long-legged friends to slow down so that he can be out in front to meet the enemy first in battle. So he's just sort of, trying to be protective and guarding them, and, nobody listens to him. But more importantly, he learns empathy for others. He just sort of sees there's adventures that most people are like him and have lost things and loved ones and have suffered, and he learns to see that the quests he takes aren't just the means to earn money to track down the sky pirates that attacked his crew, but they're a chance to do real good. There's more to his life than his own purposes. Let's see here. So additionally, Chris writes here, due to his own past cowardice, he has a soft spot for those who wish for repentance and redemption. His ideal will soon change to anyone who has made minor lapses should be forgiven a second chance to repent and redeem themselves. It's not too bad. I like the sort of short list he's got here of other traits not listed on the character sheet. Anything worth doing should be done right. When it's time to drink, it's time to drink. When you are in combat, you take it seriously. He's not great at persuading other people towards peace. He relies on intimidation, or his intimidating presence to avoid combat, and often provoking it when that fails. So he is a big, tall, brawny dwarf. He's like sort of the heaviest member of his party. So that's part of like the pose that I tried to give him, was something just grounded, hefty, open sort of arms, ready sort of stance. I mean, it's a bit straightforward of a pose, you could say, but yeah, it works. Anyway, back to him. So Fargrim isn't often seen praying to Tyr, but shows his reverence through his appearance and citing of his teachings. He's very proud of being a dwarf, and often says things like, "We were born of stone, or the classic, "Must be dwarven craftsmanship," which is a line I should start saying in real life. Well, he's gotten better at most of his paladin virtues, things like courage and duty and compassion and mercy. He still has troubles with others, namely courtesy and honesty. Now that's one thing I mentioned last time about a pattern I've started noticing is characters that aren't very courteous and have issues with manners and offending people. It's sort of a funny thing that keeps popping up. I didn't expect that. So he knows he isn't and may never be perfect, but that will never stop him from trying. So actually, back to the video again here. I started off building up, as you saw, like layer by layer, each layer a different color, keeping things really clean. I started off with the similar kind of approach that I did with Illyria, where I took the occlusion layer, which was just the black shadow, and started sort of building up a rough, polygonal, highly faceted, general shadowed occlusion layer. After I sort of started that, I really wasn't feeling it, and I took a little break, and I went for a walk. And when I came back, I just decided I'm just going to merge all those layers and just start painting. I'm just going to go old school. And so that's what I did. So, like I've said many times before, I don't have a set approach or technique. Some things work at certain times, and other things become less convenient or tedious at other times. And that's just a part of how things go. So in this case, I really didn't feel... I really wasn't feeling the clinical approach that I was taking, and I just wanted I was just excited to draw a dwarf, so I just had to just start painting it, and I was glad I did. I think I might even do this more often. It's sort of being really tedious can be a double-edged sword, where by setting things up really neatly and more organized, there's like a sense of security, or like you're not too committed to anything. Where, if you have all the skin this color and all the metal this color, you can always change it or tweak it if you have to. But at a certain point, there's times when that's exactly the right way to go about things, but at other times, and I think this is one of them, it just sort of became really stifling, and it wasn't letting me get to where I wanted properly. It was kind of steering me in the wrong direction. And it's also, there's something to be said about the confidence, where something with all the layers and colors being super organized, it can kind of damage that confidence, where everything becomes tentative and you're never committing to anything and you're never diving right in. And I think I'm still getting used to the idea of just trusting myself, where the thing about having everything on the layer is that, like, you can always change it, but that's kind of doing that with the assumption that changing things is hard, when really none of it should be too hard. I'm of the opinion that drawing is hard. It's always hard. It's always a challenge. But when it comes to redrawing a hand or some armor or some fabric or a nose, it's all just an object. And if you can just depict objects and materials, then it should never really be an issue. It'll still be always a challenge. There's always going to be like a way to do it right more correctly than others, and there's tons of ways to just get things wrong, or it can take too long. And I think the time that it can take seems daunting, but also just realizing that if I need to retweak this shoulder pad or this hand or a bit of lighting over here, it's not a big deal. Like the amount of time that you think you would save by keeping it all really, really organized on different layers so that you can adjust a slider somewhere, the amount of time and effort it takes to keep everything like that meticulous, at one point is going to cross with the amount of time that it takes to just paint it again, or just like paint that one part that you would want to fix and just get it over with. And I think with this character, I kind of made that crossing point, and I definitely don't regret it. In fact, I'm probably going to do a lot more just general painting moving forward. There's also one thing that I've learned watching these videos, especially the sped up 15-minute ones, is that the picture jerks around a lot. It's kind of hard to watch at times, and I wish that I was a lot more steady. I've got one thing that I want to try, just as an experiment to see how it goes, but even for myself moving in the future, excuse me, I'm going to try to see if I can fight my urge to just fix things when I see them, and I'm just going to focus more on one thing at a time and kind of move around more gradually, so that when you sit there and watch it, you can kind of see what I'm doing a bit better. That's one of the things that I like about this painterly approach, especially early on when I'm doing bigger chunks of color, is that you can sort of see, get a much better sense of what I'm doing. Or if it's going by really quickly, a lot of it kind of gets lost. Now, I am going to be making tutorial videos. Actually, I don't know why I haven't been making. I've only got one. I'm going to definitely. Okay, anyway, I'm going to make a bunch more. Now, this is a pause in the video. I don't know why this happened or where it's coming from, but bear with me. In the 15-minute version, if you've seen that already, it takes about 30 seconds of that version. So just bear with me. It's probably going to be stuck on here for a while. So anyway, back to dwarves. Maybe I can talk about dwarves. Yeah, I love dwarves. All my favorite characters that I've ever had are dwarves, which are, two of them. But I think I just have a lot of solidarity with dwarves. They're sort of brash and burly and hairy, and that's the kind of stuff that I guess relate to maybe. Yeah, dwarves. As far as the anatomy goes, I mean, on top of the bulky skeleton and the sort of dense muscle system, I of course did larger hands than normal, just like I do larger feet. And in this case, the feet are of course larger than a normal human's, but with a dwarf I usually make their feet taller. Like they have more vertical dimension to them, just to kind of help make them seem a bit clunkier. That's something also that like Peter Jackson did for the Hobbit movies with the dwarves, where like their boots were like these massive, like for the actors, they just had these massive oversized feet just to sort of help make their whole body seem a bit smaller. It's a big part of the trick as far as proportions go. It can get proportions can get really tough with smaller characters. Things like halflings, especially in like the 5th edition, where they've got really large heads. And I think I probably mentioned it in the Alden video because he's a halfling. But if you're playing with characters of smaller stature, you really have to be careful with your proportions. And it's okay if they do have proportions that approach kids. Like, I am actually a fan of the large-headed halflings in the 5th edition, but if you don't know how to wield that, or how to like work in that domain, or like handle the nuances of that, they can just look like badly drawn adults or badly drawn kids. There's got to be enough stuff in there to help make them look like it's a racial trait. And I don't have a set list of what sort of things those would be, but stuff like like the proportions of the hands, the look of the skin, the placement of the features of the face, and the size of the head and the forehead, and or the cranium in general. And it's a lot more than just how many heads tall is this person. And whether you're drawing people of different races, both fantasy and in real life, or people of different ages, whether it's children or seniors or middle-aged or adults or people in their 20s. Oh no, I got another yawn attack going on. But there's always benefit to drawing as many different types of people as you can all the time. One of my biggest bits of advice to any artist is don't get stuck in same face as them. You see this a lot with people, especially if you look into like their personal art and you can tell they're just drawing mostly just from their imagination, which is fine. You can get around this just with your imagination, but until they have it pointed out to them, you'll get a lot of a case where all their faces look like the same person or very much like the same person, and I think that's a weakness. It's something that if you're aware of it, that you're doing it, you should try to grow out of it. I mean, I think that seems pretty obvious, that it's a good idea. It's just, if you're not able to draw more than one face or more than 2 or 3 faces, then you can't really design characters, because now you're just designing costumes, essentially. And there's a big difference between a character and a costume. Because if they've all got the same face, then it's basically, you're just making paper dolls at that point. Oh my goodness. And that's no good. But if you put effort into drawing people of different races and ages and sexes, and just a mix and a jump and different expressions is critical, that'll help you sort of build up that mental that image bank of whenever you're drawing faces. And of course it always helps to like be able to look at a real person. There is a very big difference between a face drawn from somebody's imagination, whether it's a cartoon or if it's realistic, compared to somebody who's using reference, or even just looking at a face. It doesn't even have to be based on the face at all. It doesn't have to resemble the face that they're looking at. But if they just have it there as a reminder of how nuanced and certain details are present on an actual face, it can make quite a difference. Not everybody notices it. Like your friends that don't draw wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a referenced face and an imagination face. But the differences are there, and I think even if they can't tell you exactly which one is and which one's not. I think their brain probably can tell overall. Alright. And even if nobody can tell, it's just better if you've put that extra bit of effort into it. It's just kind of that. It's like, why wouldn't you? Couldn't you have just added that extra little bit of fidelity and just made art overall just a little bit better for everyone? But anyway, that's just sort of me ranting. So, yeah, lots of armor. So it's plate armor. It's dwarven. When I was growing up, dwarves were. This was before Lord of the Rings came out. Dwarves are always basically Celtic based or Viking based. It's again sort of shaped like a hockey net. And then Lord of the Rings came out, and whether it was Peter Jackson himself or maybe like Daniel Falconer or somebody else at Weta who came up with the idea about having all the geometric shapes as far as like an overall cultural design motif, like maybe even like John Howe or Alan Lee or one of those guys. Either way, it was a stroke of genius. It works perfectly for them. It's distinct. It's remarkable. It works. It's really versatile as well. But I think a big problem with that is that it worked too well, and now everybody, whether it's Wizards of the Coast or even like games made in Japan that involve dwarves, like everybody, like no one can break free from that. There are a few artists still around that are definitely exploring their own realms. But oh my gosh, I'm so yawny. Sorry. But I would love to one day like free the dwarf from their polygonal prison. Now in this case, I'm definitely happy to stick with the angular polygonal sort of armor frame, just for the clarity. Like people, it's so prevalent. It's just so consistent all over the world that for now, for people who are coming to me to draw their character, they've got something in mind, and I want to kind of keep things to that at least a bit. So normally I would want to give a dwarf something quite a bit more curvilinear. Kind of my thinking is like I like the idea of the angular stuff as far as like masonry work goes, sort of like geometry and all that sort of like any sort of like mathematical sort of thing, any or like crystal formation and that sort of being like an inspiration to them. But I sort of figured that like if you were a civilization known for like master masonry, then I would imagine that like a cube or an octagon would be like what you would do in kindergarten, and I'd imagine that like a sphere or like tree roots that were carved super dainty and fine and curvy and perfectly smooth and rounded would be a much more desirable achievement for a dwarf to do. Something that would be much more difficult. So I don't necessarily think that the rules should be flipped, but I would think that the dwarves would be much more apt to like flowy, lyrical, like organic shapes than an elf, at least as far as like status symbol goes or like skill markings go. But it's still something that I've been working on the side for over a year, just like in my sketchbook, just different kind of materials to use rather than the standard leather and metal and like and octagonal and hexagonal and cube forms and different stuff. But I digress. I keep digressing on this video. Yeah, so just more armor, lots of plates, lots of facets. Trying to keep it segmented and looking a bit flexible. I always love the I can't remember what they're called now, but the pointed armor toes. I just always think those are so good. I think it's from Brian Froud. Brian Froud's influence on me. I remember when I was in grade 3. Every time that my class had library time, I would go to the kids section, and there's this book, the storybook version of Labyrinth, and there it was by Brian Froud, who was of course the artist that movie had his art based on, and I would just every single time all year long I would just go there and just sit there and look at that one book, and I think I got a lot of that sort of taste for things from Brian Froud's work. Very influential, and yeah, I think most people have sort of forgotten him these days, but that's too bad. But I'll never stop drawing those pointy toes on boots, unless it contradicts the character that I'm drawing. Anyway, so yeah, lots of painting. That is kind of, I guess I was going to say it's sort of the drawback to the painterly approach, like just going in and painting it, but that happens even if I stuck to the layered system, so this is all fine. And when it comes to painterly stuff, a good sort of rule of thumb, I mean, it depends a lot on what the product is for. Like if you're doing a book cover or like box art for something, or something for a player's handbook, or even just something for a person, or just concept art, the level of polish is going to vary depending on what it's for. With concept art and something like this, I'm picturing this sort of being something for like a player's handbook or something ancillary, or something that it wouldn't be like the big advertising thing. But either way, just painting things to the point where you can just tell what they are and just letting it go. Like how glossy a material is, what shape of material it is, what condition it's in. Once you get that communicated, you can just sort of move on, because like you could take anything and just render it and just keep going. But it's something I've often found myself doing, was just going over or like spending too long on certain things, and then moving on to the next thing, and then now you got to get the next thing up to the same level of polish as that other thing. And so it does help to kind of bounce around and to move around sort of like a butterfly, touching up this and touching up that. It's sort of building it all up at a similar pace. It actually reminds me of one thing I'm going to try maybe in the next one that I learned from one of my fellow teachers back when I was teaching. Actually, I'm not teaching anymore. For the last couple months, I've got a different job. But I watched him do a speed paint once, and what he did that I thought was a really good idea was he started zoomed out, and he didn't zoom in until he had gotten everything to a suitable level for the level of zooming out he was. So he built everything up, sort of got all the main colors in the right place, then he zoomed in, and then he tightened it up from that level, and then he zoomed in, and then he tightened things up from that level, and then he kept zooming in, adding more detail as he went, and it was just such a nice way to break things down. So I'll give that a shot in the near future, and we'll see how that works out. It might be something you might be worth trying. But if you haven't yet, and if you don't see that video of mine where I do that, then just dive in and you should try it anyway. So dwarves and their beards. It's got to have a dwarf, or got to have a beard if it's a dwarf. The description did involve the 3 main braids, like one big primary one down the middle, and then 2 complementary braids that sort of entered into those it's pretty standard beard rings. You do see them on a lot of characters these days, or for the last like 15 years at least. But Chris wanted it. I'm happy to oblige. He even included a really good MS Paint drawing of like a diagram of the beard ring. So Fargrim is proud of his stature. He's tall for a dwarf and rather brawny. As the heaviest member of a party consisting of an elf, a half-elf, and a human, He's quick to note that muscle weighs more than fat when the subject comes up. So I did keep him pretty trim, especially for like a 47-year-old. Now, a 47-year-old dwarf isn't as old as a 47-year-old human, but some age there would be good. Something a bit bikery, and that would sort of help with his past. Old enough to be wizened, but still young enough to be quite strong. He's got a scar on his right eyebrow, in the middle of his right eyebrow, that extends just above and just below the brow, causing a short gap. He got a scar from just an ordinary bandit, and he's actually really embarrassed about the scar. But he's sort of found solace in the fact that, like, once a statue is made about him, then the scar will be something that's quite distinguishing. But he plans on having a fake story made up about him returning some eggs to a griffin mother, and there being a little bit of a misunderstanding when he returns it, and her giving him or slashing at his face, and that's a pretty good story for now. So yeah, he doesn't try to talk about it too much. His hair is kept at about a medium length, with the top brushed over to the left. And he also only does it with his hands. Now this was great. This was a great thing for me to hear him include that detail. I've ranted often before about how I hate fantasy characters with hairdos that look like they were shampooed or cut with clippers or by a professional hairdresser. I love hairstyles that look like they were cut in the field, like with a knife, or by an amateur, or in this case, just his hair's cut, but he sort of just styles it with his hand. So I just thought seeing that little detail included in Chris's description was just so refreshing and cool, and that I'm not the only one thinking about it. I mean, I know that I'm not, but it was just cool to see somebody else mention it. So, I mean, that's kind of how I do my hair. Just grab it with my hand and move it. But yeah, it's cool. So, I just tried to keep it rough, not looking too shampooed or anything. Just kind of dull and simple. His hands are his beard is 3 hands widths long, a little bit wider, or a little bit longer. Most of the beard hairs are tied up into 3 braids, 1 major one down the middle, with 2 minor ones down each side. And at the end of each braid is an ornate metal beard ring that has a shape like this MS Paint one. He says it's crude, but it's perfectly practical diagram. Now, as far as his weapons go, another thing about the costume is, like, in the diagram, the cloak of protection that he has is just sort of down normally, like all over the figure. You can't see, or if you can't really see where any other detail on the figure. But in this case, I threw it back over the shoulder for 2 reasons. Is one, it would just be covering up way too much. Like, no one cared. Like, we get it, it's a cloak. But also, it's part of that that him throwing off his father's advice, and it's like, come and see me. Like in battle, if his father had that cloak, it would be down. But in this case, it's thrown over his shoulder. He's got the stats. It's good to go. But he's ready to move. He's ready to book it. In the diagram, it was a small image, and it some of the details I just sort of put in just a bit of assumption, like the chainmail on the upper part around the chest and shoulders, but also this just sort of silk sort of decoration, something to make it look a little bit fancy. There was some indication in the little image of there being some level of texture, or like whether it was a crushed velvet or some sort of embroidery. So I just wanted to add some of that back in. So he's got 3 weapons. In his left hand, he's got the Javelin of Lightning. And Chris notes it's for when he can't admit that his dwarven legs can't keep up with a running foe. But at least he's not too proud to forego such a valuable weapon. Next is his maul on his back. Mostly sort of just packed out of the way. It is his primary weapon. But I found the other 2... I mean, the javelin is small, The maul is sort of there as like, we can see the important parts. He's got descriptions about the head of it, and so I at least wanted to make sure that that was in there. But the javelin would have looked just a little bit like silly on his back. You've got this big burly dwarf with this massive maul and a spooky looking sorcerer pirate boarding axe, and then just a little like doink, like just like a little bee stinger shooting out of his shoulder. It would have been a bit silly. Plus, with having like a magical item, it'd be sort of fun to like have that sort of front and center. So he's got a maul called Radiant Justice. Often deferring useful magic weapons to other party members, Fargrim wishes to use nothing other than a trusty maul, much like his father did during his adventuring days. Radiant Justice is similar to a Sunblade in that it has a bonus action. Fargrim can speak a command to cause the head of the two-handed hammer to glow bright with radiant energy, causing it to dispel magical darkness around it and deal additional radiant damage on hit. The head of the hammer is shaped like the one as shown in the image below, and a couple, different little details about how the patterning goes on it and things like that. So it did have some sort of strange Viking-ish sort of pattern. So I just tried to rearrange that sort of style, but just down the sides and around the edges, just as he described. So for this axe, this is called a boarding axe. I had to look that up. It's something, I guess, for using while you're boarding another ship. Now, I think it's just something that's designed for combat on a ship, or just for getting across with, like something that you can sort of like carry with you easily. But I could be wrong on that. I didn't have enough time to look into really like what they were and how to use them, but I was sort of thinking of the boarding axe as something like you could hook it up onto the railing of a ship and climb over it. Like it would be something for actually helping you climb into a ship and get on board, just like an ice climbing axe, but for something that goes into wood. So that's why it's got that hefty beard on the front and a sort of a long hook on the back, and just something that you could sort of like almost like a grappling hook. And that's also why I carved a hole into the back. So, and then it needed to also look super spooky and evil sorceress-ish. So that's why it's got this sort of curvy flow, and then also like some worked out patterning in sort of metal, like wrought metalwork. So actually on this one, I did this lightning motif here, just something kind of sort of some neat sort of magical carving stuff. I sort of messed up because I intended to do all this lightning effect on another layer, which you can see on the right hand side is above the weapons layer. I was going to do that just for some better lighting effects, and even if I needed to, I could tweak the color, but then I found out that I had done it on the javelin itself, and thankfully I'd picked a pretty good color for it, which I was happy with, so I was able to go with it. So a little bit of a mistake there, but don't tell anybody. Thankfully I didn't make the same mistake on this part of the axe, so I can just draw in this darkness and then erase it, or treat it like just mask it out, and then sort of help composite it in. So a little bit of a variation on Chris's description here. So yeah, sort of just based on the design that he's given me, something quite Norse. It's from a cleric who gave it to him in a temple, and she died though in that scene. But he's gonna probably add it to his justice or his vengeance mission. Sort of fun to do that stuff. I figured it'd be good to, the decoration on the side, and then anything on the front, just something sort of where the main thrust of the hit would be pretty good there. It'd be nice if that part was decorated. And I should chip it up quite a bit, just a little bit. So he's got this symbol for Tyr on the chest, just sort of chipped into his metal here. It is different than the reference picture that Chris showed me, but it's still there. It still works. I just didn't want it covered up and lost behind the beard. There's a lot of layers going on. It'd be good to, and I sort of spread it out so you could see it a bit better around his beard. Otherwise, it would be far too hidden, and you'd want to be able to show some of that sort of detail there. It's okay to have like subtle details that you'd see like later on, but there's something to be said about just trying to show as much as you can in these pictures as possible. So just simple leather belts. He just has what he needs. I picture somebody going on adventures with armor. He's not necessarily, like, loot and riches aren't really his mission. He's just sort of there to helping people. Plus the fact that he's wearing plate armor, it kind of implies that, these are sort of day trips for him. So he doesn't have much need for too many bits of equipment, and anything on his back, or anything that he's carrying would just be sort of on at the small of his back, or in some sort of like duffel bag or backpack on him there. So there's just an aged, sort of crinkly belt. I almost forgot to render out that hair there. So yeah, lots of jumping around. It's been really nice keeping that frame as a separate layer, just especially for being able to invert the colors from black and white. It really helps point out where I need more details, especially on darker things, like the hair, or even like the last character Illyria, like her clothing, especially with it being so black. Up against a white background, you lose that detail so much. So I needed to age him up a bit. Somebody who looked a bit more wizened and world-weary. I was hoping he'd have like kind of soulful eyes, or like something that you could relate to. He's sort of like an old like biker guy who cares for people, but he'll still beat the crap out of monsters and sorcerer pirates. Dwarves should be ruddy, hard workers, lots of alcohol, not too many gin blossom noses. I think they'd handle their liquor pretty well. But yeah, especially one that would be out in the sun now. I'd picture dwarves being not super well adapted to the sun. Like, they may have darker skin, but it might not be dark from melanin. It might just be darker in some other fashion, but if that's even a thing. But anyway, it's just nice to have a bit more of like some reddishness in the face, even if there's no other reason. Then it just looks a bit better, a bit more natural. You don't want it to. You'd never want skin color to just be kind of one color. There's a lot of variety in skin tone, especially on faces. So yeah, just adding some variation in there as well. Sort of fluffing out his hair, adding some highlights. Hair can be tough. One of the trickiest things about hair is how clean or oily it looks. That's still something that I'm working on getting sort of a handle on, is like greasy hair or shampooed hair. But it's fun. It's a good thing to pay attention to. Hair is one thing that a lot of people dread and a lot of people put off, but it's really worth doing studies of, especially like on the sheen. There's like a color, like a brighter colored strip and then a white strip. Or depending on the lighting, but it takes some getting used to. But it's worth going into. Basically, any time that you're drawing on something and there's something that's difficult, that's the thing that you should go and draw more of, because you need the practice. That's kind of how, especially that's sort of the advice that I've been trying to make myself follow lately. Is if I'm struggling with something, turn to a new page and fill 3 of them with studies at least, and just keep going until you get better at it. So that is Fargrim Rockbeard for Chris. It was a real joy to finally draw a dwarf. There's going to be a lot more dwarf weeks. There's going to be a lot of other particular weeks for different races and classes. But dwarves in particular. I've got a soft spot for dwarves, and I feel like, drawing more dwarves, and I think people like seeing dwarves anyway. But you're free to enter the free weekly character art lottery every Monday on Twitter. Just follow me at R&D Fantasy. On Sundays, I announce what hashtag to tweet to me on Monday, and that's how you enter, and I'll pick your character. And that's this video, so hope it helped. Thanks for watching.